So welcome back everyone to another SEWAS Psychology online workshop. And my name is Matt Yates and I'm here once again with my colleague Vicky James Perkins. So those of you who've been watching some of our previous sessions, we're now up to session 4. And today we're going to be talking about the circle understanding, which I guess is just kind of the words that we put to another phrase, which is something called formulation. So that's something that clinical psychologists often talk about, and that's basically just a posh word really for helping us to understand your child, that we've sort of put together as this idea of the circle of understanding. So today is what we're going to be focusing on. So just as a bit of a recap, sort of what led us to this session. So in our last session, we were talking about what attachment is, and I guess in a nutshell, just to kind of remind you of that, we spoke about how the early relationships with a primary caregiver, so often a parent, maybe a foster carer, just the key adults in these early experiences, they have a significant impact on how babies make sense of themselves, other people, and the world more generally. And we talked about how we can loosely kind of put those into different statements. So those perceptions of how the baby makes sense of themselves, that's kind of like I am. So I am lovable, or I am, I am fun, I am enjoyable. This ideas of other people could be that others are friendly or others are untrustworthy, and that the world is generally, a fun, safe place, or alternatively, maybe the world is quite a frightening place. So that was just kind of a real big, quick summary of what we talked about in the last session. And then we talked about sort of a bit of an analogy of a stick of rock. So we talked about how attachment and those statements of I am, others are, the world are, they're a bit like a stick of rock. So if you get a stick of rock and you snap it in half, you can see that often the writing goes all the way through it. And that we find quite like that analogy really, because it's similar for that internal working model, those statements of I am, others are, and the world are. I guess primarily because those early experiences really sort of lay down the foundations or the blueprints for kind of what those statements might be. And even many, many years later, even in adulthood, it can still be that very much that is how you experience yourself, other people in the world. It's not to say that they are completely set in stone. Absolutely, through different relational experiences, they could be shifted and could be changed. But often when we're at our most stressed and most vulnerable, often we kind of go straight back to that early blueprint. And that's where we quite like the stick of rock analogy.
And it's quite helpful to hold that in mind when we kind of try and make sense of some of the more tricky behaviours that you're thinking about with regards to your children. So we'll keep using that to come back to, what makes sense of why on earth they're still responding in this way when I ask them to put your shoes on.
Absolutely. So tell you what, we'll move on to the circle of understanding. So just to kind of let those that are watching know, you'll see that I've got these coloured boxes in the bottom right of the screen. You can completely ignore those. Those are just my special buttons to move around the presentation. But this is kind of a loose summary of the circles of understanding. And like I said, that's just kind of our way of this posh word of formulation that psychologists use. So we're going to go through it now and show you what we mean by it.
And we're going to talk through an example together, Matt and I, but I guess when you're, for those of you at home, feel free. We often ask our parents, our adoptive parents, to jot down what fits for them if you're wanting to build your own kind of understanding, or alternatively sit back and just listen out to the bits that resonate for you and your family.
Okay, so to start with the middle of the circle in red, we've got the early experiences. So I guess this is just really kind of what it describes really. So those very, very first experiences you have both in the womb and then in your first few days, weeks, months and years of life, there'll be stuff that happens to you, and those will be your early experiences, and they will start to lay down how your body and brain are making sense of yourself, other people in the world. And I guess what we hope for is that lots of experiences will be really lovely and wonderful. But what we know is that many of the children who have gone on to be adopted, often some of their early life experiences have been really quite difficult, have been quite traumatic. And they've really often had a very difficult start in life.
And you might, obviously we'll never know exactly what happened, and you might have very minimal information. That's okay. Just making some best guesses of what we know to then kind of help us and understand the sticker rock and then the behaviours.
So what we then know is those early experiences, these go on to impact that internal working model, that blueprint, that stick of rock that we were talking about. So those early experiences will, particularly in terms of what happens in relation to the primary caregiver, they will have a really significant impact on what that baby thinks of themselves, what they think of other people, and what they think of the world. Now, then, of course, if you then have that internal working model, that blueprint, that stick of rock, of course, it's therefore going to mean that that's going to really impact how you behave and how you interact with the world and the people around you. So these areas kind of go out to really visualize how that foundation, that stick of rock that you have, that influences your behavior. But then, of course, your behavior isn't kind of just on your own. You don't just kind of do your behavior and that's it. Generally, no matter how we behave, people respond to us. So particularly if you're a parent at home watching this is probably the bit that you're really going to identify with. You, of course, are going to see the way that your child behaves. So that behavior is being carried out by the child. But of course, that is being seen, being observed, being responded to by you as a parent. And then here's what's kind of really interesting is, of course, the child is behaving a certain way. And of course, parents, you're going to respond to that. So this kind of goes both ways. And what you end up with is this idea of how child is behaving a certain way, parent is responding, and then child is just responding to that response, and just go on and on a cycle. And that is kind of the dance that is all of us in terms of how we interact with each other. The issue or the trickiness that kind of starts to come about is we often, very understandably, we get kind of stuck, or at least we kind of keep all our focus just on this behavior at the surface. So very understandably, we as human beings, we're looking at what is in front of us. We're responding to what that child is doing right here, right now. But what then it has the chance to be missed or maybe not able to be held in mind during the interactions is all the stuff that's underneath it. So all of that internal working model, that blueprint, that stick of rock, and even beneath that extra layer of the early experiences, often we're responding to the behavior when in fact actually what would be most helpful to us is to think actually about what is it behind that, what is it underneath that, what is those early experiences and that internal working model that are influence that behavior.
And that's such a, yeah, I was just going to say, Matt, your diagrams were reminding me that it's so hard parenting a child who has that early trauma inside. You're almost having to like double read them, aren't you? Like we hear a lot, all behaviors communication, and as you know, the reason you're sat here watching this kind of stuff is because you're interested, you value trying to understand this in a different way. So when a child is communicating to you, go away, however they're doing that, whether they're a 2-year-old or whether they're a 16-year-old, naturally that would make us try and move away. But I guess what you're talking about, Matt, is we're having to like double read this in a way that we usually don't to this extent. So that can be really tricky, particularly when the kind of the underlayer stuff is often very different from what a child is kind of showing us on the surface.
It's so tricky. Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. And like, hopefully we're going to work through an example now, which might give you a bit of an idea as to, what you might see as the surface behavior, but think about how that links to what we know that's underneath it.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we've got here now an example, so this is an adoptive parent that Vicky and I work with, and she's very kindly shared her experience of her child's early experience, internal working model and behaviour. So we're very fortunate and very appreciative that we're able to sort of use that information. And we'll just kind of basically, work through a bit of an example. So we're not saying this is definitive. We're not saying necessarily this will be the same for your child, but just an example of how we might use this process to use these circles. So moving right into the centre of the circle, so the early experiences. So just to kind of briefly go through this, so I'm aware there's a few sort of acronyms and shortenings of words, so I'll just go through it so it makes sense. So we're aware that for this child, while they're actually in the womb, there was an awful lot of in utero stress. So the mum was in a very difficult situation. So there was an issue of lack of nutrition for mum, generally as a chaotic living environment. So even inside the womb, that baby was getting a really strong message of high levels of stress and basically kind of almost kind of giving it lots of signals of you are going to be born into a frightening, chaotic environment.
And Matt, just to, sorry to interrupt you, I just clock in that that's quite new understanding over the last few years for us, some parents,
Mm,
that we often, and I know in reports often we think about the environment once a baby's born, and we consider some of the pre kind of factors, but what we're understanding much more about now is that, like you said, that period where a baby's in the womb is actually pretty significant in how that baby's starting to develop and adapt and adjust their physiology to be ready to survive an environment where there's much more danger. So I
mm,
guess just often we hear from parents, my child was removed from birth, so understandably we presume that they weren't exposed to that stuff. And what we're learning more about is that actually if a child's removed from birth, that suggests that there's significant risk factors during those very early stages of development. So I guess just a flag up, that's quite new, to
mm.
the emphasis on how important that stage was as well. Can be quite revealing for parents who just kind of presume that that was okay.
Yeah. I guess the way I often think of it is it makes a lot of sense if you think of, say, imagine a deer is going to be born into a jungle environment where there's lots of tigers and lots of predators. So it's almost kind of giving that baby in the womb the signals of, in the environment you're going to be born to is going to be dangerous and frightening. So we need to, from day one, for you to be primed and ready to survive.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so yeah, so whilst it's quite kind of a new layer, I often find it makes an awful lot of sense. It's quite essentially a useful adaptation.
Yeah, and just as some snapshot, just to kind of bring this to life a little bit, you know, obviously from in the third trimester, babies can hear and things. Just hearing, starting to hear a loud voice, perhaps, and then the experience of the cortisol starting to come through the body, that baby's going to start to associate those things together and kind of get start to get fused at that stage. So even in those more kind of obvious ways to kind of understand how that baby's already starting to make sense of their world, can be helpful then to when they're born, when they experience a loud noise, what they're used to experiencing in their body starts to yeah, come into play.
Yeah. So yeah, so I guess, so moving on more about this child. So we're aware that birth mum was domestically violent towards dad. There's a question mark, the possibility that maybe mum had some learning needs. The suggestion that maybe there was some extra challenges for her to have skills to be able to parent.
And I guess,
Um,
sorry, Matt, to interrupt, but I just mindful about what does that mean, domestic violence? Of course, we know it means mum hit dad. I guess just trying to track what that might have felt like as a little baby. So when you look at people, what you're seeing is people getting very angry or agitated. You starting to hear shouts, pain, people not being available, a lot of conflict. So I guess when we often read those headline kind of descriptions, don't we? And I guess what we're trying to do is kind of check, what does that mean for a baby? What would the baby have heard? What would they have seen? What would that have been experienced as when they needed a nappy changed, or when their tummy rumbled, or they had wind and needed burping? So we're just trying to hold that a little bit in mind when we read through these kind of headlines.
I think that's such a good point, because we're so used to kind of just brushing over a word or a statement, and actually think about what that means is really, really important. Yeah. So again, we've just got more of a snapshot, and it really is just a collection of different things. But you can really, I'm sure those of you that are at home are reading this, just to pick out some ones. So things like being left alone in a high chair. So that's really significant in terms of, you think of a baby's what they're relying on in terms of their development and their learning is interaction. It's kind of interaction with people. It's kind of learning to use their body. It's kind of that experience of, for example, when a baby first learns that when it's been put on its front, it just about starts to build up the strength to be able to like push up from the floor and lift up its upper body. If you're just left alone in a high chair, that's going to be significantly impacted or limited. So generally, ignored in noisy flats. So really tapping into that idea again of being when you're in a noisy environment, that could actually be quite frightening and confusing. Lots of people coming and going. So that's a suggestion of maybe perhaps there were other individuals who were interacting with the child. We don't know necessarily what happened.
And I
Maybe
guess
that.
it's a double, sorry, Ma, I just think it's a double whammy there, isn't it? There's the, like you said, the chaos of the noise and the different kinds of noises, which will be frightening to a baby, overwhelming, confusing, as well as an absence of what looks like a parent who's able to like listen and respond sensitively. So as simple as, oh dear, that noise frightened you, come here, have a cuddle, have a little rock, it was just the door, it's all right, or it was just the postman. So there's like an onslaught of stressor in the environment that is going to be overwhelming for that baby. And babies often show overwhelmingness by just looking quite placid. We often read that babies are just quite placid and easygoing. Inside there's a lot going on, as well as no one there to kind of translate that for their baby or comfort them. So when you just describe that kind of chaos and the noises, just try to track developmentally what's happening to that baby as they're having an onslaught of stress and an absence of anyone to be able to help them with that in those moments.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt. Yeah.
No, it's fantastic, and yeah, you're absolutely right. It has a massive impact. Yeah, so I'm aware there's so much stuff here, and we probably won't be able to go through it all, but just one that's certainly jumping out of me. So what Vicky was just mentioning there, that might kind of tap into that idea of no relational interaction, so or not knowing how that went. So while kind of on the surface, no toys isn't necessarily an outrageous bad thing, perhaps it just sort of highlights that maybe there wasn't a thought about what the baby's needs might be, what its needs might be for its learning, for its development, for its interest.
And a key thing for when we go through these experiences is this is an example, a case, sadly, where there's lots of, I guess, what we describe as quite big headlines. It hits quite a lot of the stuff we know is really risky, violence, chaos, the kind of neglect of being contained in a chair, moves, all those kinds of things, which kind of feels more clear are going to be impacting on this child's development. But also we also try and track the kind of smaller moments. So for those of you who adopted your children from birth, where there perhaps was only one foster carer, and I say only in that way because we, in the best scenario we can ever think of with regards to adoption, even for a baby to be settled and receive a lot of good care and nurture through a foster carer, to lose that main carer to move to an adoptive family is a trauma. And that's you never see cases just like that. There's, when you try to unpick what might have been that child's experience in foster care, and we talk a bit about how hard that is, it reveals a lot of kind of areas that might have not been met as much as that we'd hope for a baby. And not to criticize any person, but I guess just to acknowledge, if you're reading this list and are thinking, well, my child didn't have half of that, why are they still behaving in this way? There's often, when you kind of scratch beneath the surface, there's very small moments that can kind of tease apart why that might have been traumatic for that baby at that time.
And it just, hearing you say that, Vicky, really reminds me of how a really sensible question that lots of both professionals and families that we work with ask is, well, hang on a second, all this stuff happens whilst they're a baby, how they can't remember it. And you're absolutely right. Certainly, they won't have the memories that we think of in terms of our remembering actually a sequence of events. But their brains, their bodies, their neurons, their nervous system, that's what remembers. So that brain and body of that baby remembers that things were frightening and dangerous, and we had to be in survival mode. And it's learning that that's kind of a useful state to be in.
It's a good point to hold on to, Matt, is that they won't have, often in a lot of the early trauma, there won't have been words to it. So it's even more difficult to kind of process. It would just have been encoded through like sensory cues. So maybe a smell might have precipitated some shouting, or it might be the sound of a click of a door particularly, or the bars of a cot might remind of the cot changes suddenly in a different bedroom. And again, not that we can ever be in control and know all of those things, but I guess just an appreciation that our babies encode this stuff at a very physical bodily level. Sometimes that's harder when there's no words to make sense of it. I guess just acknowledging that kind of we'll go on to how that looks in a baby, how a baby manages that, but it's very real.
So what do you think, Vic? Should we talk more about the things here, or should we move on?
Let's hold them in mind, because I guess the key is often we get this kind of list when you've read your kids' cars and through some adoption reports, but let's try and bring it alive when we link it to the behaviours. So try and hold everything. Okay.
Yeah, we can come back to it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So if this is the center of our circles, if we just move back out just to show the whole picture. So we're now going to move from the early experiences to the second ring. So there's text in blue. So we're going to start at the top here with the I am statement. So just a reminder, this is this blueprint, this internal working model that we've been talking about.
And with this I am statement, how it helps me remember is, and I forget this as I become a grown up, but for children, it's clear as adults, we look at that awful chronology of trauma. It's clear that that is in no way anything to do with that baby. In no way is it that baby's fault. It's a very unfortunate, a catalogue of failings in lots of different ways. But of course, we have to track back to what we understand of child development. And when babies are born, when children are very little, their egos are huge. They think that they are the center of the universe. So the only way to make sense of anything that's happening to you around you is it's about you. So I guess we know that in child development, so we need to hold that to then kind of jump to these guesses about what sense would that child have made of these experiences.
Wow, thank you. So we're going to zoom into the I am statement. So this is the top bit of the second circle.
Yeah. So I guess I always think of, in this case, I have got this image of a baby being left in a high chair for an extensive amount of time, with trying to signal. The baby would have put their hands out, would have made some goo noises or shriek noises, whatever. It would have been trying a lot, chucking things. It would have tried hard. This baby would have tried hard, he, to have gained in, never mind the physical kind of pain and discomfort they would have been in. So I guess it would make me think the kind of feeling of I'm invisible. All of these people are around me, coming in and out, and I am trying to get them to notice me. Yeah, just that sense of don't really exist here and just not here. So
and like with that feeling of that eventually the baby would probably actually kind of give up trying, but still that horrible feeling, that feeling of fear, being frightened, of being forgotten, that would still very much remain. That stress was still very much there, even though perhaps on the surface it would appear that maybe they would eventually just stop trying to get that attention on them.
And that sense of kind of I'm nothing. So you're feeling all this stuff physically, sensory, emotionally, but you get no feedback in it. So it's just sort of all this stuff doesn't make sense. It's kind of nothing and everything all at one muddled up. So yeah, that idea of I'm nothing, I'm not, and we've said here, and often we use this language of I'm not worthy, and of course a baby wouldn't be thinking they're not worthy, but just a sense of this isn't good enough, no one's coming into me, I'm nothing, or yeah, I guess sometimes you break the language down a little bit. Yeah, so these are our guesses to then kind of link to behaviours. So I am, often it's unlovable, not worthy, not good. Bad, we often hear, particularly if you're moved a lot. Your sense is it must be because of me. It's something about me. Why me? Why was I moved a lot? Particularly if there's some difficulties with siblings staying, or all the different kind of complications that occur around that.
It's really helpful, Vicky, that you just said about how all of this is our guesses, and that's absolutely right. So whilst you might maybe have some information about those early experiences, when it comes to this blueprint, this internal working model, this little rock, and also later when it comes to just all this stuff, is so much of it is guesswork. We can't actually necessarily ask a baby or a child kind of what these statements are for them. We have to kind of pick it apart ourselves. And we may always not get it 100% right, but we can have a good idea broadly of what might some of the themes be.
Yeah, and I guess years on, clinically, when we work with families, we do actually hear children say and parents say, they said to me, I'm bad. You don't want me to have ice cream because I'm bad. You will get rid of me. So I guess
Mm.
actually, even though we're labeling this, we do hear those children describe themselves in those terms, don't we? And
Mhm.
later on, so it kind of suggests that this is connecting to an extent with what they're experiencing.
Cool. Should we move on?
Yeah. Okay.
So if we zoom back out, so we're now going to we've done the I am statements in the second circle. We're going to move over to the others are statements.
So Matt, just trying to recap now. So if so babies need eyes. They the first thing they do is try and track their mother's eyes, usually the birth mother first. If when they do look at eyes, you said there was some violence, so that eyes would have been angry at times. There was some mental health issues, so perhaps at times the eyes would have been shut down if this parent had low mood or distracted. If I see my key people hurting each other or being terrified at one time or frightened at another, if I'm suddenly then with another set of eyes looking after me, a foster carer or um, paternal grandparent, I can't even track who's who. So I guess some ideas about what we might think about others generally from those early experiences.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, and safe, changeable, not predictable. They're not consistent. They're sometimes terrifying. Sometimes they're lovely and they cuddle and they look lovingly at me or warmly at me. And then other times they're furious with me for crying.
Mm.
Um, they just disappear. As an adult, we can see there was a planned transition, introduction, but in a baby's kind of internal world, they were there. I was in the car and they never came back. They're just gone. So
Mm.
others are really unpredictable, chaotic, unreliable. So some themes that we hear from families
Mm.
and from young people in their, like, when they're making sense of those early experiences.
It just makes so much sense, doesn't it? Of kind of like you said, how so many of the things you were picking apart there, of how, yeah, generally this is a real theme of absolutely there may well have been times when certain adults or people were kind and lovely and sweet, but if that's with a big sprinkling of at times really frightening and dangerous and loud, very quickly it's going to make sense of actually it's just unpredictable and unreliable. Yeah, sometimes the needs are met, but sometimes they weren't, and very quickly it's going to be, well, if people are unreliable, there's no point in bothering to sort of invest in them and kind of actually think that they will be able to look after and meet my needs.
And it just gives me a sense of I've got to be on alert here because I
Mm.
don't know which way this is going to go. So I've just got to pay real good attention. Even if I'm having a nice time, this is feeling good. You never know when it's going to change or how it's going to
Mm.
change. So I can't quite relax into it. So it gives me that sense of just, I got to be on alert for this one.
Better to be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
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 So we zoom back out. So
Yeah.
we've done the others are bit, and then we'll go back into the world is. So this is our final bit of the internal working model.
Yeah, so let's remember, Matt. For that, this baby, the world. So people were coming in and out of the doors a lot. There was moves into foster care. Sometimes other members of the family would look after this child. There was witnessed violence, and of course, there's a statistic for every episode of violence police are called out. There's 33 incidences before that. So just the
Mm.
idea that that's just the tip of the iceberg often. Um, so yeah, it was actually dangerous. Um, People were scared, confused frequently, and just chaos. I guess, babies, they like that really boring routine, don't we? I wake up in this room, we have this breakfast in this chair, we go and play these toys in this living room, over and over and over. Hugely boring, but just what's needed to create a real sense of safety for this little one. I guess ironically, the only thing that would have been a pattern is the chaos that would have become to feel familiar, and the only thing that she would have known.
And it's just for me, it's that real sense of, yeah, just overall the world is just unsafe and unknown and frightening and just, yeah, really not encouraged to go out and explore it because you're just thinking, gosh, it's just a frightening, dangerous place.
Hmm. Okay.
Should we move on?
Yeah.
So zooming back out, so here we've got our whole picture again. So we're finally now going to look at behavior. So what we're talking about is how these early experiences and that internal working model go on to influence our behavior. So I'm kind of zooming in just to the top. If you imagine almost kind of all these
Yeah.
words just in a ring around.
And Matt, sorry, it just dawned on me. Sometimes I know we can feel a bit like all doom and gloom about kind of the internal working model and early trauma. But I guess just to acknowledge as well, this of course counts for those moments where the world might have felt comforting or predictable in pockets, or sometimes it's with women or with men. You know, there'll be a lot of also kind of positive experiences in this internal working model. I guess what is important to tease out is how this then impacts on the behaviours that you're struggling with or that your child isn't shifting from. So that's why we're kind of digging deeper a little bit into the trickier stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So this, like I said, we're very privileged that this adoptive parent has kindly sort of just listed some of the behaviours that they see in their child. And I guess now it's sort of seeing if we can make some possible links between what we saw before and some of these behaviours that we're seeing now.
Mm.
So Vicky, where would you like to start?
Well, should we start with a big one often, which is the angry, violent behaviours? So for this, if we just start there, because we hear that often, and we'll talk about the other side. But so often this would have been, this little one was about 3, is that right, Matt, when she came to her adoptive family? So the anger, the aggression, that you've noted it there, shouting, kicking, hitting, would have looked like what we often hear parents say: I was just told it's just the terrible 2s or terrible 3s. They'll grow out of it. Often it can be so so hard when adoptive parents do try and share what they're struggling with, to kind of be put down as all kids do that. It's just the age and stage. Whilst there is always an element of child development in that, of course, what we know is when a child had this kind of earlier start, this is more than developmental or what we'd expect at that stage. So big toddler tantrums frequently that don't die down easily. Often we see this then as children get older in different ways, in slamming doors, sometimes, you know, punching walls, hurting their siblings, the more kind of, you know, obvious kind of violent or being very aggressive kind of stuff. Often parents describe they just go from 0 to 100 in seconds. It's really hard to see a trigger. It keeps happening, even though they know if they smash that up, they're not going to have their computer game. They keep doing it every time, like it just doesn't make sense. So we often hear that from parents, don't we, Matt? About that, like methods of learning from it and just being disproportionate to what's happened.
And it kind of it really brings me back into what we talked about very sort of early on when we were doing these online sessions, of how if a child's brain has learned that it's got to really quickly go into survival mode, one of those big survival modes is fight. And if you're just stuck using that part of your brain, going back to our hand model, going back to your being stuck in your limbic brain and your downstairs brain, and you're just relying on that fight mechanism, if that's all you've got, is that your main way, if that's your main way of just coping with those difficult feelings you've got inside you, that's all you've got. And it's just so difficult then for those who are looking on and being on the receiving end of that fight drive.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Matt, because on the surface, and I remember from uni, the social psychologists, we could easily say, well, if a child or toddler's experienced violence, which we know this one will have, they copy behaviour. And of course, there's an element of that. But what we're talking about is a little bit different again, or in addition to, is that children learn to understand and start to practice managing big feelings, big emotions, over repeated practice at it with a safe adult that can help them make sense of that and calm them. That only then do they begin to be able to better manage when you say, it's time for TV to go off, it's dinner time, or when you say we now have to go for our walk. That's taken thousands and thousands of practicing, having big blowouts and then being calmed. So when we hear about children kicking off really quickly and in really big ways, like explosions, what that tells us is kind of a sign that this is a child who has not had the experiences or the practice that we'd expect a child to have had in those earlier years. They're sort of missing those kind of key building blocks, which isn't to say they can't do it. It's a clue to us that developmentally they're much earlier on with regards to managing their emotions. They're understanding them, never mind managing them. We'll go into that a little bit more, but just that's a real alarm bells in this child has lacked enough opportunity to safely practice big feelings in my body and what I do about them.
Absolutely. Right. So I tell you what, one that's really drawing my attention is kind of over in the right hand side of bullet points. We've got controlling, defiant, tries to be in charge, and that for me really makes sense in terms of we think about this child. Their early experiences were that the people in their life were very inconsistent and generally couldn't look after them. So suddenly, when this child is now in a wonderfully safe, loving, warm, new adoptive family, and those parents are very understandably are just doing what parents do, which is try to say, this is what we're doing. You try to organize a day. You try to control behavior, and very normal response to it. But that child's brain has been primed and ready to say, adults cannot keep me safe. Okay, I cannot rely on adults. They will not do what's right for me. And when you've got that horrible feeling of anxiety that the world is frightening and something bad's going to happen, it makes complete sense. And that child is desperately going to try to reduce that feeling of anxiety and fear by trying to control their environment. So they'll absolutely be resistant to someone else trying to be in charge, be controlling, and then themselves, to respond to that, will try to really control what's going on around them and what their parents are doing and what they are doing.
And I think you're right, Matt. That control is a really big theme. We see it, all the time, and it's really hard because I was just thinking about your extra layer of how this impacts on us. When we, as grown adults, are being controlled, or sometimes it feels like we're being manipulated by a 3-year-old or a 16-year-old. That's really hard. That really pushes our own buttons of being violated, or it kind of really hits hard to us. So I guess that behavior, I guess just to say that no wonder you find that really challenging and perhaps makes you furious. And what we're saying is not, let them be in charge. I guess it's just trying to understand how important it's been for your child to hold that control, and that they won't be thinking it. It'll just be a kind of an impulse or go-to survival strategy. So it's just kind of really acknowledging they've had to get there over repeated times, and it makes sense then why they're still struggling to let that go, to trust you when their hearts have been so broken, when they've done that in the past.
What one are you drawn to next?
School, I was just thinking, actually, particularly this time, we often hear that our children struggle in school. Sometimes school works really well, particularly if there's a very sensitive, attuned teacher. And what school can offer is a lovely structure, routine, predictability that kids are needing oodles of when they haven't had it earlier on. But I guess what we often hear is that children struggle in school, and what we mean by that is they will either show us through those big behaviours, through the we talked in our previous video, Matt, about they will fight. They'll go to their throwing the chairs, shouting, pinching, hurting other kids. They will flee. They will run out of the classroom, and they will avoid things, and they will freeze. Sometimes these are the kids that seem to be all right, but they're just shut down. They just feel too unsafe to even access their key adult, their teaching assistant, their teacher, to help them in any way possible. And also school. So school can be an issue because they're required to kind of extend their attachment onto another key person. But also school is hard because often developmentally So that being separated from their parents is a trickier quest when developmentally is still earlier on in that attachment. So being away from someone who you're starting to feel safe with can feel really hard. And I'm jumping a bit, but developmentally, even though we often hear, you know, oh, he's a bright boy, he knows. And yes, that's often the case, not always, but often the case. What we know is that these children are needing to be so hypervigilant. So for this little one, her environment, her world has been so crazy and chaotic and frightening and unpredictable. She will be on high alert to any new environment, even school. So when she steps through those gates in the morning, her brain will be working flat to the dozen to try and read other people's faces. What's your face today, teacher? Are you going to suddenly flip? Or teaching assistant, and they're kind of looking, who's going to reject me? Who can I trust? Friendships. It's so busy, isn't it? What the things that a child is having to be alert to in a way that a child who's experienced a safe enough start won't be. So they are working hard, but it might not be on their number bonds, or it might not be on their blends of sounds. So often then they can kind of fall behind, or they can be seen to be not trying, not listening, not paying attention. There's lots of reasons to kind of tease apart, but those are some of the big ones we hear often. And then, or they kind of just about manage it. They get home and it's like a fizzy bottle of pop. As parents, you're taking off the lid and boom, the explosion comes in all sorts of ways.
Because I guess they're just putting all their energy into just about keeping it together in school, because their brain is, although they may not look like it, their brain is massively in that spiral mode, and they're just desperately trying to kind of keep things together and cope. And then they get home, and that is a place where they do feel safer, and you know they can be the real selves. And yeah, boom, like I said, bottle pop. It's so hard for parents.
Yeah, and school's a big deal. Like, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but I keep reminding myself of it. Even though parents are the kind of key attachment figures, they're there a lot of the time. It needs to feel safe, or that needs to be part of the thinking as well on how do we help my child feel safe and start to not need these kinds of survival strategies.
So,
Yeah.
I'm
So
pretty aware, like, you know, we've got lots of stuff here, and you know, being psychologists, we could talk about this for hours, couldn't we? And I guess it's just maybe we'll get close to kind of to wrapping up now. But I guess it's just what I guess the big picture that we're trying to convey to anyone who's watching this video is just to start bearing it in mind. So we get really focused on the surface behaviour, but what we actually know is that makes an awful lot of sense when we can think about a child's early experiences, and that blueprint, that internal working model, the second ring. And whilst maybe it doesn't necessarily in this moment in this video give us the answers, it can be a really useful starting point, because if we can think about the behavior in relation to that early experience, we might, for example, be able to see a behavior in different ways. So just to give one easy example could be, oh, hang on a second, right now their brain feels really unsafe. So if we instead focus on the behavior, which is someone, you know, maybe kicking and screaming and throwing things, and think, what can I do in this moment just to help that child's brain to feel safe? That could be really great starting place to kind of think about it in a slightly different way.
And I just, sorry, Matt, one of the main themes that often come in mind as well is how does your child, what do they show you in their behavior when they're hurt? So some children will come very close, seek you and accept your comfort. And what's one of the trickiest things as an adoptive parent when you've got this huge amount of love and commitment and energy to give is when your children push you away. And that's one of the things Matt was talking about, was on the surface that looks like, I'm all right, I don't need you, I'm fine. And you're trying to respond to that. Or if you think, well, I know they're not fine, I know they need me, and you try to go closer and give that cuddle and they just can't tolerate it. Parents often can get sort of trapped in that. So you know, when you're making your guess about, well, I know I can have a sense of underneath what's going on, but how do I help them learn I'm not, you know, I can be relied on, I can offer safety. But this, like you say, Matt, is a start of just tracking what would make sense of that behavior, because until we understand better or have some better guesses on why are they continuing to do that, what is this sticker rock for my kid, it's trickier to then work out what they need next, because the usual traditional kind of parenting strategies, as you will have, you know, parents tell us, they don't work. It needs to be something else on top of kind of the traditional stuff, or something a bit different to it.
And I think almost in a way there, Vicky's given a little bit of a taster, and that's certainly going to be what one of our future online sessions would be. I think you actually, well, what do we do differently? And we absolutely have the plan to put together some further online sessions to help talk about that more.
Okay, great.
So I think, should we leave it there for today?
Yes. Great.
Right,
Thank
thanks
you.
for watching, everyone.
Bye.